In the sterile corridors of Stevens Industries, a dedicated financial analyst was about to lose everything she'd worked for. What started as a routine day at the office took a shocking turn when she discovered her desk had been reassigned to the CEO's inexperienced niece. Isabelle Monroe wasn't your typical corporate pushover. For 15 years, she had meticulously documented every process and built an impeccable reputation for integrity. When she encountered systematic workplace corruption designed to destroy careers, she realized her extensive knowledge of client relationships and company secrets would become her most powerful weapon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Seattle rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 32nd floor as Isabelle Monroe stepped off the elevator at Meridian Solutions, her Monday morning ritual intact. Large coffee in hand, laptop bag slung over her shoulder, and the familiar anticipation of diving into her latest. The open office buzzed with its usual energy, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the low hum of conversations that formed the soundtrack of corporate ambition. After 5 years, this space had become her second home, and her desk in the southwest corner, with its view of Elliott Bay and meticulously organized files, was her sanctuary. But as she rounded the familiar corner toward her workspace, Isabelle's steps faltered. Her desk was bare. Completely, utterly bare. The ergonomic monitor she'd requisitioned 18 months ago was gone. The jade plant her mother had given her for her first promotion, thriving under the careful ministrations of her daily watering routine, had vanished. The framed photo of her graduation from the University of Washington, where she'd been the first in her family to earn a degree, was nowhere to be seen. Even her specialized lumbar support cushion, purchased with her own money after too many late nights hunched over quarterly reports, had disappeared. What the hell? The words escaped before she could stop them, drawing glances from nearby colleagues. Isabelle set her coffee down on the empty desk surface with trembling hands, her analytical mind racing to process what she was seeing. This had to be a mistake. Facilities must have mixed up work orders. Maybe they'd moved her temporarily for maintenance. There had to be a logical explanation. She spotted a lone cardboard box tucked beneath the desk, hastily labeled I. Monroe in black marker. Her stomach dropped as she recognized her own handwriting on sticky notes, still clinging to file folders, now jumbled together like discarded memories. The careful organization that had taken her months to perfect, color-coded client files, reference materials arranged by frequency of use, her collection of spare phone chargers and emergency snacks, all of it crammed into a single undignified box. Isabelle? The tentative voice belonged to Kevin from accounting, who occupied the desk adjacent to what had been her territory. I'm really sorry. I thought someone would have told you. She straightened, forcing her voice to remain steady. Told me what, Kevin? He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her eyes. About the reassignment. They moved your stuff Friday afternoon. I assumed HR had given you notice. Reassignment? The word felt foreign on her tongue. Reassignment to where? Kevin gestured vaguely toward the far end of the office, where a cluster of smaller cubicles housed junior associates and temporary staff. The corner spot by the copier. I think they set up your computer there. Isabelle's vision blurred slightly as the implications crashed over her. 5 years of exemplary performance reviews, countless overtime hours, 3 major client wins that had brought in millions in revenue, and they'd relegated her to the equivalent of corporate Siberia without so much as a conversation. Who authorized this? She managed to ask, though she was already mentally cataloging every interaction she'd had with management over the past month, searching for clues she might have missed. I don't know the details, Kevin said, his discomfort palpable, but I heard it was a direct order from the top. Before Isabelle could respond, the elevator chimed, and she watched as her supervisor, Michael Chen, emerged alongside a young woman she didn't recognize. The woman was clearly new. She had that eager, slightly overwhelmed expression that Isabelle remembered from her own first day. She was attractive in an effortless way that spoke of good genetics and expensive skincare, her blonde hair pulled back in a style that was both professional and casually perfect. Her suit was designer, Isabelle noticed with the unconscious assessment of someone who'd spent years stretching a modest salary to look the part in corporate America. Michael's eyes found Isabelle's across the office space, and she saw something flicker across his features. Guilt, perhaps, or embarrassment. He said something to the young woman and began walking toward Isabelle's former desk, his companion trailing behind. "Isabelle," Michael said as he approached, his usual easy smile strained around the edges. "I was hoping to catch you. I'd like you to meet Jessica Ashford. She's joining our team as a senior analyst." Senior analyst. The words hit Isabelle like a physical blow. Not junior analyst, not associate, not intern. Senior analyst. The same title that had taken Isabelle 18 months to earn after starting as a coordinator. Jessica extended her hand with a smile that seemed genuine despite the awkwardness of the moment. "It's so nice to meet you, Isabelle. I've heard wonderful things about your work from Uncle Brad. From Mr. Ashford." "Uncle Brad, of course." Isabelle accepted the handshake, noting the softness of Jessica's palm, hands that had never known the calluses her own father had earned in construction, hands that had been manicured rather than cracked from student jobs washing dishes to pay for textbooks. "Jessica will be taking over the Morrison Industries analysis," Michael continued, seemingly oblivious to the way Isabelle's jaw tightened. Morrison Industries was her account, her baby. She'd spent 3 months nurturing that relationship, understanding their supply chain challenges, building trust with their CFO. "I'm sure Isabelle can help you get oriented," Michael added, and the forced cheerfulness in his voice made it clear this conversation was as uncomfortable for him as it was devastating for her. "Actually," Isabelle said, her voice carefully controlled, "I think there might be some confusion. I wasn't informed about any reassignment. Perhaps we should clarify the situation with HR." Michael's smile became even more strained. "Of course. Why don't you get settled in your new space, and we can sort out the details later." It wasn't a suggestion. Jessica looked between them, clearly sensing the tension but lacking the experience to navigate it. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I don't want to cause any problems. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding?" Despite herself, Isabelle felt a flicker of sympathy for the girl. Jessica seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the situation, which was more than could be said for Michael or whoever had orchestrated this humiliation. "It's not your fault," Isabelle said, and meant it. The blame lay elsewhere, with people who made decisions from corner offices and saw employees as line items rather than human beings. After Michael shepherded Jessica away to begin her orientation, Isabelle found herself alone with her cardboard box and the slow-burning realization that something fundamental had shifted. She picked up the box, heavier than it looked, weighted with 5 years of accumulated work life, and made her way across the office to her new assignment. The cubicle by the copier was everything her window desk was not: cramped, noisy, and positioned to ensure maximum foot traffic interruption. The outdated computer monitor flickered when she turned it on, and the desk chair squeaked with each movement. It was, she realized with growing clarity, designed to make her uncomfortable, designed to make her leave. As she unpacked her personal items, the photo looking somehow smaller in this reduced space, the jade plant drooping as if it too mourned the change, Isabelle noticed Sandra Torres approaching from the HR department. Sandra was a consummate professional, always impeccably dressed and politically astute enough to have survived 3 regime changes in upper management. "Isabelle," Sandra said, her voice carrying that particular HR blend of sympathy and authority, "I wanted to check in and see how you're settling into your new workspace." "Sandra," Isabelle straightened, drawing on every ounce of her professional training. "I'm wondering if you could help me understand the rationale behind this move. I don't recall any performance issues or organizational changes that would necessitate a reassignment." Sandra's smile was practiced, revealing nothing. "As I'm sure you can appreciate, the company is always looking for ways to optimize our resources and bring fresh perspectives to key accounts. Sometimes that means making adjustments to ensure we're positioning our talent most effectively." The corporate speak was flawless, each word carefully chosen to say nothing while sounding like everything. Isabelle had heard variations of this language before, usually preceding layoffs or restructuring, that somehow always benefited management while diminishing everyone else. Fresh perspectives, Isabelle repeated slowly. You mean Jessica Ashford's lack of experience is somehow preferable to my 5 years of client history and institutional knowledge? I wouldn't characterize it quite that way, Sandra replied, her tone remaining diplomatically neutral. Jessica brings valuable new insights and energy to the team. We believe having a mix of experience levels strengthens our overall capabilities. It was masterful deflection, Isabelle had to admit. Sandra had managed to reframe nepotism as diversity and demotion as opportunity. If the situation weren't so personally devastating, she might have appreciated the artistry of it. I see, Isabelle said. And was there a particular reason I wasn't consulted about this change beforehand? Something flickered in Sandra's eyes. The briefest suggestion that she wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation either. But it passed quickly, replaced by professional resolve. Leadership felt it was important to implement the transition efficiently. Change can be disruptive when it's drawn out unnecessarily. Translation: they knew she would have fought it, and they wanted the fait accompli to minimize resistance. It was a calculated move, probably discussed in meetings where her name was reduced to a headcount and her contributions dismissed as easily replaceable. The conversation continued for several more minutes, each exchange revealing less while confirming more. By the time Sandra departed with wishes for Isabelle's continued success, the message was clear: adapt or leave, but don't make waves. As the day wore on, Isabelle found herself watching Jessica struggle with the Morrison Industries files from across the office. The younger woman was clearly intelligent. She asked good questions and took detailed notes, but she lacked the context that came from months of relationship building and industry knowledge. Watching her fumble through reports that Isabelle could navigate in her sleep was simultaneously satisfying and heartbreaking. Colleagues stopped by throughout the day, offering sympathetic looks and carefully worded condolences. Some seemed genuinely upset by the situation. Others appeared more interested in the office drama than the human cost. A few, she noticed, avoided her entirely. Whether from embarrassment or calculation, she couldn't be sure. By 5 o'clock, as the office began to empty and the rain outside intensified, Isabelle sat in her diminished cubicle and felt something crystallize inside her. The initial shock had faded, replaced by a cold, analytical clarity that she recognized from her most challenging client problems. This wasn't random. This wasn't about fresh perspectives or organizational efficiency. This was deliberate, personal, and part of something larger. Someone had made a decision to marginalize her, and they'd done it in the most humiliating way possible. They'd stripped away not just her desk but her dignity, her sense of belonging, her carefully constructed professional identity. They'd done it publicly, without warning, and with the clear expectation that she would simply accept it. But Isabelle Monroe hadn't worked her way up from nothing to be dismissed so easily. She'd survived financial aid applications and work-study jobs, demanding professors and impossible deadlines. She'd earned her place here through merit and determination, and she wasn't about to let it be taken away without understanding exactly who was behind it and why. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, Isabelle's gaze swept across the office one final time. Jessica was still at her former desk, staying late to master files that should have been hers. Michael was in his office, door closed, probably avoiding any further uncomfortable conversations. Sandra Torres was long gone, having delivered her corporate messaging and retreated to whatever moral compromises allowed her to sleep at night. But somewhere in this building, in a corner office with an even better view of Elliott Bay, Bradley Ashford was making decisions that affected real people's lives. And for the first time in her 5 years at Meridian Solutions, Isabelle Monroe was going to find out exactly what those decisions were and why her name had appeared on someone's list of problems to be solved. The rain continued to fall as she walked to the elevator, but something inside her had stopped feeling cold. Tomorrow she would begin to understand what had really happened here. And then she would decide what to do about it. The rain continued to fall as Isabelle walked to the elevator, but something inside her had stopped feeling cold. Tomorrow, she would begin to understand what had really happened here. And then she would decide what to do about it. The next morning, she arrived at Meridian Solutions with the same coffee and laptop bag, but with a fundamentally different purpose. The analytical mind that had made her successful at client assessments was now focused on a new target, her own company. She settled into her cramped cubicle and opened a new spreadsheet, not for client data, but for something far more personal. By 10 a.m., she had messaged David Park on the company's internal chat system. David had started at Meridian the same week she had, beginning his career in help desk support before working his way up to IT manager. If anyone understood the company's digital footprints and organizational patterns, it was him. "Coffee break?" she typed. "I need to pick your brain about something." His response came quickly. "Server room. 20 minutes. I've been wondering when you'd want to talk." The server room was their traditional meeting place for sensitive conversations. The constant hum of cooling fans and electronic equipment made eavesdropping impossible. David was already there when she arrived, leaning against a rack of servers with his arms crossed and a concerned expression. "That was brutal yesterday," he said without preamble. "I've seen some cold moves in my time here, but that was next level." "You knew it was coming?" Isabelle asked, though his expression had already answered her question. "I knew something was coming. Friday afternoon, I got a work order to set up a new workstation and transfer user profiles. When I saw it was your desk going to someone named Jay Ashford, I put 2 and 2 together." David ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture she recognized from their countless late-night troubleshooting sessions. "I should have warned you, but I thought maybe you already knew." "No one told me anything." Isabelle leaned against the adjacent server rack, feeling the cool metal through her blouse. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Always am. Is this part of something bigger? Are other people being repositioned?" David's silence stretched long enough to confirm her suspicions before he finally spoke. "Remember when Patricia Williams suddenly decided to, quote, pursue other opportunities last month? Patricia had been a senior project manager with 12 years at the company. Her departure had been announced as a mutual decision, complete with the usual corporate well wishes and talk of new challenges. That wasn't her choice, was it?" Isabelle said. Her workload got mysteriously redistributed to 2 junior PMs about a week before her announcement. Same pattern as yours. Sudden reassignment, no explanation, designed to make her uncomfortable enough to leave on her own. Who else? Robert Chen from Business Development, reassigned to data entry. Marcus Thompson from Strategic Planning. His projects got handed to consultants. David pulled out his phone and showed her a notes app filled with names and dates. "I've been keeping track. 7 people in 6 months, all with tenure, all making above median salaries." The pattern was clear and damning. Isabelle felt a familiar sensation, the same analytical clarity that helped her identify inefficiencies in client operations. But this time, she was the inefficiency being eliminated. "There's something else," David continued, glancing around despite the privacy of their location. "Last week, I was asked to pull some analytics on employee cost per output ratios. Guess whose name was highlighted in red on the report? Mine, yours, and about 15 others." The report went straight to the executive suite. He paused, weighing his words. "Isabelle, I think they're planning something big. This isn't just about a few reassignments." Before she could respond, David's phone buzzed with an urgent IT request. "I have to go, but we should talk more." "Tonight? Murphy's Pub on Pine Street?" 7 o'clock, she agreed. The rest of the day crawled by, as Isabelle attempted to focus on her assigned tasks, while her mind churned through implications and connections. She found herself studying her colleagues with new eyes, wondering who else might be on the hidden list. Who might be next to arrive at an empty desk? At lunch, she made her way to the executive floor under the pretense of delivering a report that could have been emailed. The 35th floor was a different world. Thick carpets, mahogany paneling, and an atmosphere of hushed importance that stood in stark contrast to the bustling energy of the lower floors. She didn't encounter Bradley Ashford, but she did run into Thomas Mitchell, emerging from the conference room with a stack of documents and a grim expression. Thomas had been with Meridian since its early days, back when it was a scrappy startup rather than a corporate machine. He was one of the few people who commanded respect across all levels of the organization. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Isabelle," he said, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there in previous conversations. "How are you settling into your new role?" The question seemed innocuous enough, but something in his tone suggested deeper meaning. "It's an adjustment," she replied carefully. Thomas glanced around, then gestured toward an empty conference room. "Do you have a minute?" Inside the room, with the door closed, his demeanor shifted entirely. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. What happened to you yesterday isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a comprehensive restructuring plan that's been in development for months. You know about it? I've seen the preliminary documents. Workforce Optimization 2. 0 feet, they're calling it. The goal is to reduce payroll costs by 40% while maintaining output through increased efficiency and strategic personnel decisions." The clinical language couldn't mask the human impact. They're systematically forcing out experienced employees. The plan is to replace senior staff with recent graduates and contract workers. Lower salaries, no long-term benefits, more manageable expectations. Thomas's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd watched too many good people become casualties of corporate strategy. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because 15 years ago I was in your position, different CEO, same playbook. I had evidence of questionable practices, people who would have supported me, a chance to make a real difference." He looked out the conference room windows at the Seattle skyline. "I chose to keep my head down, play the game, survive. I've regretted it ever since." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply sharing information that might help you make your own informed decisions." Thomas stood, straightening his tie with practiced precision. "But I will say this. If someone were to document what's really happening here, if the right information found its way to the right people, it might level the playing field considerably." After he left, Isabelle sat alone in the conference room, staring at the mahogany table where decisions were made that affected hundreds of lives. The conversation had confirmed her worst suspicions, while also suggesting possibilities she hadn't considered. That evening at Murphy's Pub, David arrived with a laptop bag and the careful demeanor of someone carrying secrets. They found a corner booth away from the after-work crowd and ordered drinks they barely touched. "I did some digging," David said, opening his laptop and angling the screen away from other patrons. "Remember how I mentioned employee cost ratios? I managed to access the full analysis." The spreadsheet he showed her was devastating in its clinical precision. Names, salaries, productivity metrics, and, most tellingly, vulnerability assessments that rated employees on their likelihood to challenge reassignment or termination. "Look at this column," David pointed to a series of coded ratings. "They've literally scored people on loyalty, pliability, and resistance potential." Isabelle found her name on the list, rated as high resistance/high cost. The algorithm had identified her as both expensive to retain and likely to fight back against unfavorable treatment. "There's more," David continued, navigating to another tab. Email chains between Bradley Ashford and external consultants about legacy employee transition strategies. "They've been planning this for months." As she read the communications, a name kept appearing: Marcus Webb of Webb Strategic Solutions. The name was familiar. She'd heard it mentioned in company meetings as a competitor, but the context had always been vague. "Who is Marcus Webb?" she asked. "Bradley's former business partner. They founded Meridian together, but Webb got forced out about 5 years ago. Messy split from what I heard." David pulled up a new browser tab. Here's where it gets interesting. Webb's been systematically poaching Meridian's clients and employees for years. It's like he's playing a long game. Isabelle stared at the information, her analytical mind beginning to process patterns and possibilities. "David, if someone wanted to contact Webb's company, hypothetically speaking, how would they go about it?" David closed his laptop and looked at her seriously. "Hypothetically? I'd say that someone would want to be very careful about what they shared, and why. Webb might be the enemy of your enemy, but that doesn't automatically make him your friend. But if someone had information that could damage Bradley's plans, then that someone would have leverage. The question is whether they'd be willing to use it, and what they'd be willing to risk in the process. As they left the pub, Isabelle felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. The evidence was clear, the pattern undeniable, and the implications far-reaching. She could document everything, file complaints through proper channels, and hope that corporate bureaucracy would somehow protect her and her colleagues. Or she could take a different path entirely. The rain had stopped, leaving the Seattle streets glistening under the streetlights. For the first time since finding her desk empty, Isabelle Monroe smiled. Tomorrow, she would begin researching Marcus Webb in earnest. And then she would decide just how far she was willing to go, to fight back. The rain continued to fall as Isabelle walked to the elevator, but something inside her had stopped feeling cold. Tomorrow, she would begin to understand what had really happened here. And then she would decide what to do about it. The next morning, she arrived at Meridian Solutions with the same coffee and laptop bag, but with a fundamentally different purpose. The analytical mind that had made her successful at client assessments was now focused on a new target, her own company. She settled into her cramped cubicle and opened a new spreadsheet, not for client data, but for something far more personal. By 10 a.m., she had messaged David Park on the company's internal chat system. David had started at Meridian the same week she had, beginning his career in help desk support before working his way up to IT manager. If anyone understood the company's digital footprints and organizational patterns, it was him. "Coffee break?" she typed. "I need to pick your brain about something." His response came quickly. "Server room, 20 minutes. I've been wondering when you'd want to talk." The server room was their traditional meeting place for sensitive conversations. The constant hum of cooling fans and electronic equipment made eavesdropping impossible. David was already there when she arrived, leaning against a rack of servers with his arms crossed and a concerned expression. "That was brutal yesterday," he said without preamble. "I've seen some cold moves in my time here, but that was next level." "You knew it was coming?" Isabelle asked, though his expression had already answered her question. "I knew something was coming. Friday afternoon, I got a work order to set up a new workstation and transfer user profiles. When I saw it was your desk going to someone named Jay Ashford, I put two and two together." David ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture she recognized from their countless late-night troubleshooting sessions. "I should have warned you, but I thought maybe you already knew. No one told me anything." Isabelle leaned against the adjacent server rack, feeling the cool metal through her blouse. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Always am. Is this part of something bigger? Are other people being repositioned?" David's silence stretched long enough to confirm her suspicions before he finally spoke. "Remember when Patricia Williams suddenly decided to, quote, pursue other opportunities last month?" Patricia had been a senior project manager with 12 years at the company. Her departure had been announced as a mutual decision, complete with the usual corporate well wishes and talk of new challenges. "That wasn't her choice, was it?" Isabelle said. "Her workload got mysteriously redistributed to 2 junior PMs about a week before her announcement. Same pattern as yours. Sudden reassignment, no explanation. Designed to make her uncomfortable enough to leave on her own. Who else? Robert Chen from Business Development, reassigned to data entry. Marcus Thompson from Strategic Planning. His projects got handed to consultants." David pulled out his phone and showed her a notes app filled with names and dates. "I've been keeping track. 7 people in 6 months, all with tenure, all making above-median salaries." The pattern was clear and damning. Isabelle felt a familiar sensation, the same analytical clarity that helped her identify inefficiencies in client operations. But this time, she was the inefficiency being eliminated. "There's something else," David continued, glancing around despite the privacy of their location. "Last week, I was asked to pull some analytics on employee cost per output ratios. Guess whose name was highlighted in red on the report? Mine. Yours, and about 15 others." The report went straight to the executive suite. He paused, weighing his words. "Isabelle, I think they're planning something big. This isn't just about a few reassignments." Before she could respond, David's phone buzzed with an urgent IT request. "I have to go, but we should talk more. Tonight? Murphy's Pub on Pine Street?" 7 o'clock, she agreed. The rest of the day crawled by as Isabelle attempted to focus on her assigned tasks while her mind churned through implications and connections. She found herself studying her colleagues with new eyes, wondering who else might be on the hidden list, who might be next to arrive at an empty desk. At lunch, she made her way to the executive floor under the pretense of delivering a report that could have been emailed. The 35th floor was a different world. Thick carpets, mahogany paneling, and an atmosphere of hushed importance that stood in stark contrast to the bustling energy of the lower floors. She didn't encounter Bradley Ashford, but she did run into Thomas Mitchell emerging from the conference room, with a stack of documents and a grim expression. Thomas had been with Meridian since its early days, back when it was a scrappy startup rather than a corporate machine. He was one of the few people who commanded respect across all levels of the organization. "Isabelle," he said, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there in previous conversations. "How are you settling into your new role?" The question seemed innocuous enough, but something in his tone suggested deeper meaning. "It's an adjustment," she replied carefully. Thomas glanced around, then gestured toward an empty conference room. "Do you have a minute?" Inside the room, with the door closed, his demeanor shifted entirely. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. What happened to you yesterday isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a comprehensive restructuring plan that's been in development for months. You know about it? I've seen the preliminary documents. Workforce Optimization 2, 0 feet they're calling it. The goal is to reduce payroll costs by 40%, while maintaining output through increased efficiency and strategic personnel decisions. The clinical language couldn't mask the human impact. They're systematically forcing out experienced employees. The plan is to replace senior staff with recent graduates and contract workers. Lower salaries, no long-term benefits, more manageable expectations. Thomas's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd watched too many good people become casualties of corporate strategy. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because 15 years ago, I was in your position. Different CEO, same playbook. I had evidence of questionable practices, people who would have supported me, a chance to make a real difference." He looked out the conference room windows at the Seattle skyline. "I chose to keep my head down, play the game, survive. I've regretted it ever since." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply sharing information that might help you make your own informed decisions." Thomas stood, straightening his tie with practiced precision. "But I will say this. If someone were to document what's really happening here, if the right information found its way to the right people, it might level the playing field considerably." After he left, Isabelle sat alone in the conference room, staring at the mahogany table where decisions were made that affected hundreds of lives. The conversation had confirmed her worst suspicions, while also suggesting possibilities she hadn't considered. That evening at Murphy's Pub, David arrived with a laptop bag and the careful demeanor of someone carrying secrets. They found a corner booth away from the after-work crowd and ordered drinks they barely touched. "I did some digging," David said, opening his laptop and angling the screen away from other patrons. "Remember how I mentioned employee cost ratios? I managed to access the full analysis." The spreadsheet he showed her was devastating in its clinical precision. Names, salaries, productivity metrics, and most tellingly, vulnerability assessments that rated employees on their likelihood to challenge reassignment or termination. "Look at this column," David pointed to a series of coded ratings. "They've literally scored people on loyalty, pliability, and resistance potential." Isabelle found her name on the list, rated as high resistance/high cost. The algorithm had identified her as both expensive to retain and likely to fight back against unfavorable treatment. "There's more," David continued, navigating to another tab. "Email chains between Bradley Ashford and external consultants about legacy employee transition strategies. They've been planning this for months." As she read the communications, a name kept appearing: Marcus Webb of Webb Strategic Solutions. The name was familiar, She'd heard it mentioned in company meetings as a competitor, but the context had always been vague. "Who is Marcus Webb?" she asked. "Bradley's former business partner. They founded Meridian together, but Webb got forced out about 5 years ago. Messy split from what I heard." David pulled up a new browser tab. Here's where it gets interesting. Webb's been systematically poaching Meridian's clients and employees for years. It's like he's playing a long game. Isabelle stared at the information, her analytical mind beginning to process patterns and possibilities. "David, if someone wanted to contact Webb's company, hypothetically speaking, how would they go about it?" David closed his laptop and looked at her seriously. "Hypothetically? I'd say that someone would want to be very careful about what they shared and why. Webb might be the enemy of your enemy, but that doesn't automatically make him your friend. But if someone had information that could damage Bradley's plans, then that someone would have leverage. The question is whether they'd be willing to use it, and what they'd be willing to risk in the process." As they left the pub, Isabelle felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. The evidence was clear, the pattern undeniable, and the implications far-reaching. She could document everything, file complaints through proper channels, and hope that corporate bureaucracy would somehow protect her and her colleagues. Or she could take a different path entirely. The rain had stopped, leaving the Seattle streets glistening under the streetlights. For the first time since finding her desk empty, Isabelle Monroe smiled. Tomorrow she would begin researching Marcus Webb in earnest, and then she would decide just how far she was willing to go to fight back. The fluorescent lights in HR's waiting area hummed with the same oppressive frequency that had haunted Isabelle Monroe's dreams for weeks. She clutched a manila folder containing her carefully documented evidence. Bradley's emails, the manipulated performance reviews, the suspicious timing of resignations following Jessica's arrival. Each page represented hours of meticulous preparation, yet sitting here now, the folder felt as substantial as tissue paper. Sandra Torres emerged from her office with the practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Isabelle, come in. I understand you wanted to discuss some workplace concerns?" The meeting lasted exactly 14 minutes. Isabelle Monroe presented her case with the precision of a prosecutor, laying out the pattern of favoritism, the systematic marginalization of experienced staff, and the ethical violations that had transformed their department into Bradley's personal kingdom. Sandra listened with the attention of someone performing listening rather than actually hearing. "These are serious allegations," Sandra said when Isabelle Monroe finished. "I want you to understand that filing a formal complaint will trigger an investigation. That means interviews with all parties involved, including Bradley and Jessica. It means scrutiny of your own performance and conduct during this period. Are you prepared for that level of examination?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Isabelle Monroe recognized the warning beneath Sandra's professional tone, the subtle suggestion that complainants often found themselves under more scrutiny than the accused. "I've documented everything carefully," Isabelle Monroe replied, though her voice carried less conviction than her words suggested. "Documentation is important, but perception matters too. Bradley Stevens has an excellent reputation with senior management. Jessica Ashford, while new, comes highly recommended by the family. You, on the other hand." Sandra paused, consulting Isabelle Monroe's file. "You've had some performance discussions recently. There might be questions about whether these concerns stem from legitimate workplace issues or personal frustrations with recent feedback." Isabelle Monroe left the meeting feeling as though she'd been professionally mugged. The folder that had felt so light going in now seemed to weigh nothing at all. Not because it was empty, but because its contents had been rendered meaningless by the machinery of corporate self-protection. She was still processing Sandra's veiled threats when Jessica Ashford appeared beside her desk later that afternoon. The younger woman looked uncomfortable, her usual composed demeanor replaced by something approaching anxiety. "Could we talk?" Jessica asked quietly. "Maybe grab coffee?" They found a corner table at the cafe across the street, far enough from the office to speak without whispered paranoia. Jessica stirred her latte with mechanical precision, clearly struggling with how to begin. "I know what people think about me," she said finally. "The nepotism hire. Uncle Bradley's pet project. I'm not stupid. I see the looks, hear the conversations that stop when I walk by. Isabelle Monroe waited, unsure whether this was confession or confrontation. The thing is, Jessica continued, I didn't ask for any of this. I wanted to work somewhere else, build my own reputation. But Uncle Bradley insisted this would be best for my career and my family. Well, saying no to Bradley Stevens isn't really an option in our family. So why are you telling me this? Jessica's laugh held no humor. Because what I'm seeing here isn't normal, is it? The way he talks about some of you, the comments he makes about people's attitudes and loyalty. I may be young, but I've worked other places. This feels different. Wrong. Isabelle Monroe found herself studying Jessica with new eyes. The polished exterior remained, but underneath she glimpsed something unexpected. Genuine discomfort with the situation she'd been placed in. He's been asking me to keep notes, Jessica admitted, about conversations, interactions, who seems, quote, engaged, and who might be, quote, struggling with the transition. I think he wants me to spy on people. The revelation shouldn't have surprised Isabelle Monroe, but it still sent a chill through her. Bradley wasn't just playing favorites. He was building a surveillance network within his own team. What do you plan to do about it? Isabelle Monroe asked. I don't know. That's why I wanted to talk to you. You seem like someone who'd know the right thing to do. Before Isabelle Monroe could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas Mitchell. Can you stay late tonight? Need to discuss something important. She found Thomas in his office after 7, when the building had emptied to its nighttime skeleton crew. He looked older than she'd ever seen him, as though the weight of unspoken truths had finally become too much to bear. I heard you went to HR today, he said without preamble. Sandra Torres has a reputation for sharing information with the right people. Isabelle Monroe sank into the chair across from his desk. You're saying Bradley already knows. I'm saying you need to understand what you're up against. Thomas opened his desk drawer and pulled out a worn folder. 15 years ago, I was where you are now. Different manager, same corporate machinery. I thought if I followed the rules, documented everything properly, justice would prevail. He slid the folder across to her. Inside were photocopies of emails, performance reviews, and HR complaints that painted a depressingly familiar picture. A conscientious employee being systematically undermined by a manager with connections and influence. What happened? Isabelle Monroe asked, though she suspected she already knew. I filed my complaint, followed every procedure, dotted every I, crossed every T. You know what I got? A, quote, performance improvement plan that set impossible standards, followed by a, quote, mutual agreement to seek opportunities elsewhere. The manager I complained about? He got promoted 6 months later. Quote dot. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression a mixture of regret and hard-earned wisdom. The system isn't designed to protect people like us, Isabelle. It's designed to protect itself. And people like Bradley know exactly how to work that system. So I should just accept it, let him destroy careers and poison the workplace because fighting back is futile? I'm not saying that. I'm saying you need to understand that playing by their rules means playing a game that's rigged against you. If you're going to fight, you need to be smarter than I was. Isabelle Monroe stared at the folder in her hands, seeing her own potential future reflected in Thomas's cautionary tale. But something in her rebelled against the idea of quiet acceptance, of letting Bradley's corruption continue unchecked, simply because the official channels were compromised. That night, alone in her apartment, Isabelle Monroe found herself staring at her laptop screen. Marcus Webb's business card lay beside the keyboard, the investigative journalist who'd been asking pointed questions about corporate practices in their industry. She'd kept his contact information after their brief conversation at the industry conference, telling herself it was just networking. Now, as she typed and deleted various opening lines for an email she wasn't sure she should send, Isabelle Monroe realized she was standing at a crossroads that would define not just her career, but who she was as a person. Sandra Torres had made it clear that official channels would likely lead nowhere. Thomas Mitchell had shown her the personal cost of failed resistance. Jessica Ashford had revealed the extent of Bradley's manipulation. But reaching out to Marcus Webb would cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. It would mean abandoning the corporate protocols she'd always trusted, potentially exposing herself to retaliation that could destroy her career entirely. It would mean choosing between the safety of silence and the uncertain consequences of truth-telling. Isabelle Monroe's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she wrestled with the weight of her decision. Outside her window, the city sprawled in all directions, full of people who'd faced similar choices, who'd had to decide whether their principles were worth the price of upholding them. The cursor blinked in the empty email field, waiting for her to decide what kind of person she was going to be. Isabelle Monroe sent the email at 2:47 a.m., her finger hovering over the send button for nearly an hour before finally committing to the irreversible click. The message to Marcus Webb was carefully crafted, professional, vague enough to maintain plausible deniability, but specific enough to pique his interest. She'd simply mentioned having information about corporate governance issues at her company, and suggested they meet to discuss potential collaboration on his upcoming article about industry practices. Sleep didn't come that night. Every creak of her apartment building sounded like footsteps. Every notification ping from her phone made her heart race. By morning, she'd convinced herself that she'd made a terrible mistake, that Bradley would somehow know what she'd done before she even arrived at work. Marcus Webb replied before she'd finished her first cup of coffee. Interesting timing. I've been hearing whispers about Stevens Industries. Coffee today at 3 p.m.? Know a place downtown where we won't be interrupted. The morning dragged with surreal normalcy. Bradley held his usual team meeting, discussing quarterly projections and client satisfaction metrics, as though the company wasn't slowly cannibalizing itself from within. Isabelle Monroe found herself studying his face, searching for signs that he knew about her late-night correspondence. But his demeanor remained unchanged, confident, controlling, oblivious to the rebellion brewing beneath the surface of corporate politeness. Jessica caught her eye during the meeting, offering a small, almost conspiratorial nod. Since their coffee conversation, something had shifted between them. Not quite friendship, but a mutual understanding that they were both trapped in a system that served neither of their interests. The cafe Marcus had chosen occupied the ground floor of an old brick building downtown, the kind of place that attracted freelance writers and graduate students rather than corporate executives. Isabelle Monroe arrived early, claiming a corner table where she could watch both entrances while appearing to read industry journals on her tablet. Marcus Webb looked exactly like she'd expected: rumpled blazer, slightly unkempt beard, the perpetually alert expression of someone who made his living asking uncomfortable questions. He slid into the seat across from her with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to clandestine meetings. "You look nervous," he observed, signaling the waitress for coffee. "I should be. What I'm about to tell you could end my career. Or it could save it. Depends on what you're dealing with and how we handle it." Marcus leaned back, studying her with the professional assessment of a journalist evaluating a potential source. "Why don't you start by telling me what's really happening at Stevens Industries?" Isabelle Monroe had rehearsed this moment, but sitting here now, the weight of betraying her employer, however corrupt, felt heavier than she'd anticipated. She began carefully, outlining the systematic favoritism, the manufactured performance issues, the atmosphere of fear that had transformed their workplace into Bradley's personal fiefdom. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes in a weathered notebook that looked like it had survived countless similar conversations. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment, processing what he'd heard. "It's not unusual," he said finally. "Corporate nepotism, workplace bullying, managers abusing their authority. I see variations of this story every month. What makes yours different is the scale and the systematic nature of it. This Bradley Stevens character sounds particularly ruthless. There's more." Isabelle Monroe pulled out her phone, showing him screenshots of emails she'd carefully documented. "He's been building cases against specific employees, manufacturing justifications for termination. I think he's planning a major purge." Marcus studied the images, his expression growing more serious. "This is good documentation. But you realize what you're risking by sharing this with me? If Stevens finds out you're talking to journalists, he'll destroy you professionally. He's going to destroy me anyway. At least this way, maybe I can prevent him from destroying others." Noble sentiment. But nobility doesn't pay rent or buy groceries. Are you prepared for the reality of what comes next? The question hung between them like a challenge. Isabelle Monroe thought about Thomas Mitchell's cautionary tale, about Sandra Torres's veiled threats, about Jessica's uncomfortable position as an unwilling spy. She thought about all the colleagues who'd already been driven out, their careers damaged by Bradley's systematic campaign of professional assassination. I can't live with doing nothing, she said finally. Marcus nodded slowly. Then we need to be smart about this. I'll need more than workplace grievances to build a story that matters. Financial irregularities, client conflicts of interest, anything that shows this goes beyond simple management dysfunction. I might be able to get that. But it would mean really crossing the line, accessing information I'm not supposed to have. Quote dot. I'm not asking you to break any laws, but if information comes your way through normal business channels, and if that information happens to support a story about corporate accountability. Marcus shrugged. I can't control what sources choose to share with me. They talked for another hour, establishing protocols for secure communication, discussing what kind of evidence would be most compelling, mapping out the potential consequences of publication. Marcus explained how he'd protect her identity, the legal safeguards available to whistleblowers, the likely timeline for investigation and publication. By the time they parted ways, Isabelle Monroe felt like she'd signed an invisible contract written in consequences she couldn't fully predict. Walking back to her car, she noticed details with heightened clarity. The number of security cameras, the faces of people who might or might not be paying attention to her, the weight of her phone containing Marcus's contact information. Back at the office, the afternoon proceeded with the same artificial normalcy that had characterized the morning. But now Isabelle Monroe found herself viewing everything through the lens of potential evidence. Bradley's casual comment about restructuring opportunities took on sinister significance. Jessica's uncomfortable silence during discussions of team dynamics seemed more loaded with meaning. Even Thomas Mitchell's careful neutrality appeared strategic, rather than passive. As the day wound down, Isabelle Monroe realized that she'd crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Whether Marcus's investigation ultimately succeeded or failed, whether Bradley's reign of terror ended or continued, she had fundamentally altered her relationship with the corporate world she'd once trusted. She was no longer just an employee trying to do her job. She was an active participant in a larger struggle between accountability and corruption, between individual conscience and institutional power. The cursor had stopped blinking. The decision was made. The knock on Isabelle Monroe's cubicle wall came at 4:17 p.m. on Thursday, exactly 1 week after her meeting with Marcus Webb. Bradley Stevens stood there with his practiced smile, but something predatory flickered behind his eyes. The look of a hunter who'd caught an interesting scent. Isabelle, could I see you in my office? There are a few things we need to discuss. The walk to his office felt like a funeral march. Isabelle Monroe's mind raced through possibilities. Had someone seen her with Marcus? Had her increased attention to documentation patterns been noticed? Had Jessica reported their conversations despite her apparent sympathy? Bradley's office reflected his personality. Oversized desk, awards prominently displayed, family photos strategically positioned to remind visitors of his connections. He gestured for her to sit while he remained standing, a classic power play that she recognized but couldn't counter. I've been reviewing team performance metrics, he began, pulling out a folder that looked ominously thick. And I have some concerns about your recent productivity and engagement levels. Isabelle Monroe forced herself to remain calm. I'd be happy to discuss any specific issues you've identified. It's more about patterns than specific incidents. Missing deadlines, reduced collaboration with team members, what some colleagues have described as a, quote, negative attitude toward new initiatives. Bradley opened the folder, revealing what appeared to be a comprehensive dossier. I'm particularly concerned about reports that you've been asking unusual questions about company policies and procedures. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Isabelle Monroe realized that her careful documentation efforts hadn't gone unnoticed. Bradley had been building his own case against her while she'd been building hers against him. I believe in understanding the systems I work within, she replied carefully. If asking questions about proper procedures is problematic, Perhaps you could clarify what type of inquiry would be more appropriate." Bradley's smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. "The type of inquiry that focuses on your assigned responsibilities rather than broader organizational concerns that frankly aren't within your purview." Before Isabelle Monroe could respond, Jessica Ashford appeared in the doorway. "Uncle Bradley? You wanted to see me after the Monroe meeting?" The casual reference to their conversation as the Monroe meeting sent a chill through Isabelle Monroe's spine. This wasn't a spontaneous performance review, it was a coordinated operation. Actually, Jessica, perfect timing. "Since you've been working closely with the team, I'd value your perspective on some of the behavioral patterns we've been discussing." Jessica entered the room reluctantly, her discomfort visible despite her attempts to maintain composure. Isabelle Monroe caught her eye, searching for some sign of the alliance they'd tentatively formed, but Jessica's expression remained carefully neutral. "I've asked Jessica to monitor team dynamics as part of her management training," Bradley continued. "It's important for emerging leaders to understand how workplace attitudes affect overall productivity." The betrayal felt like ice water in Isabelle Monroe's veins. Every conversation, every moment of apparent sympathy, every shared concern about Bradley's methods. Had it all been performance? Had Jessica been reporting back all along, feeding Bradley information to use against her? "Jessica has provided some interesting observations about your interactions with other team members," Bradley said, consulting his notes. "Apparently, you've been quite vocal about your concerns regarding recent personnel decisions." Isabelle Monroe looked at Jessica, who seemed to be struggling with some internal conflict. When their eyes met, Jessica's composure cracked slightly, revealing something that looked like guilt mixed with desperation. "I think there might be some misunderstanding about," Jessica began, but Bradley cut her off with a sharp look. "The documentation speaks for itself," he said firmly. "Isabelle, I'm placing you on a performance improvement plan, effective immediately. You'll have 30 days to demonstrate marked improvement in attitude, collaboration, and focus on your assigned duties. Any further concerns about your commitment to this team's success will result in immediate termination." The PIP packet was already prepared, printed, and organized, evidence that this confrontation had been planned well in advance. Isabelle Monroe flipped through the pages, seeing her professional death warrant laid out in corporate jargon and impossible metrics. "I'd like some time to review this thoroughly before signing," she said. "Of course. But I'll need it back by Monday morning." "And Isabelle?" Bradley's voice carried the satisfied tone of someone who believed he'd won a decisive victory. "I trust this conversation will help clarify your priorities going forward." Isabelle Monroe left his office clutching the PIP documents, feeling like she was carrying her own execution order. Jessica followed her out, catching up at the elevator bank. "It's not what you think," Jessica said urgently, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I never meant for it to go this far. He twisted everything I said, took conversations out of context." "Did you report our coffee meeting?" Isabelle Monroe asked directly. Jessica's silence was answer enough. "Why?" The question came out more wounded than angry. "Because he made it clear that my future here, my family's opinion of me, depended on proving my loyalty to his vision. He said that real leaders sometimes have to make difficult choices about team members who aren't committed to success." The elevator arrived, and they rode down in tense silence. As the doors opened on the parking level, Jessica grabbed Isabelle Monroe's arm. "I know you probably hate me right now, but you need to know, this isn't over. He's planning something bigger. There's a meeting scheduled with senior management next week about, quote, optimizing team composition. Your PIP isn't about improvement. It's about building justification for a mass termination event." Isabelle Monroe stared at her, processing the implications. How many people? At least 6. Maybe more. Anyone he considers a, quote, cultural misfit or resistant to change. Thomas Mitchell's name was on the list. The parking garage suddenly felt like a cavern, their voices echoing off concrete walls that seemed to close in around them. Isabelle Monroe realized that her meeting with Marcus Webb hadn't just put her own career at risk, it had potentially accelerated Bradley's timeline for his corporate purge. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Jessica looked younger than her years, the polished professional facade finally cracking completely. Because I can't live with what I've become. Because maybe there's still time to stop this if we work together. Isabelle Monroe studied her face, trying to determine if this was genuine remorse or another layer of manipulation. The PIP documents felt heavy in her hands. 30 days to prove herself according to metrics designed to ensure her failure. But 30 days might be more time than Bradley's other targets would have. And now, with Jessica's insider knowledge and her own connection to Marcus Webb, she might have the tools to fight back. The web was tightening around all of them. But Isabelle Monroe was no longer sure who was the spider and who was the prey. Isabelle Monroe met Marcus Webb at a different cafe this time, one Jessica had suggested, a small place in the arts district where corporate executives never ventured. Jessica arrived 10 minutes late, her usual composure replaced by nervous energy as she slid into the booth beside Isabelle Monroe. "This is risky for all of us," Marcus said without preamble, studying Jessica with journalistic skepticism. "How do I know this isn't an elaborate setup? Corporate spy suddenly develops a conscience?" "Because I brought proof," Jessica replied, pulling out her phone. "Screenshots of emails, meeting notes, the termination list. Everything Uncle Bradley thought he was sharing safely with family." Isabelle Monroe watched as Jessica scrolled through dozens of damning communications. Bradley's casual discussions of cleaning house, his strategies for manufacturing performance issues, his timeline for what he called organizational optimization. The evidence was devastating. "Jesus," Marcus muttered, photographing the screen. "This is a systematic campaign. He's not just targeting individuals, he's restructuring the entire department around personal loyalty. The senior management meeting is Monday," Jessica continued. "He's presenting it as necessary cost-cutting, but the real agenda is eliminating anyone who might challenge his authority or question his methods." Isabelle Monroe felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. "If we expose this now before he can execute his plan, we might save Thomas and the others. But we'll definitely destroy ourselves in the process." "Maybe not," Marcus said thoughtfully. "Jessica, you're his niece. If this story breaks with you as a source, it becomes about family courage, about doing the right thing despite personal cost. That's powerful narrative protection." Jessica laughed bitterly. "You clearly don't know my family. Bradley isn't just my uncle, he's the golden child who can do no wrong. Going against him means losing everything. Job, family relationships, financial support for my student loans. Everything." The three of them sat in silence, each contemplating the magnitude of what they were considering. Isabelle Monroe realized that her original plan, quietly documenting Bradley's abuses for potential future use, had evolved into something much larger and more dangerous. "There's another option," she said slowly. "What if we don't wait for the Monday meeting? What if we force Bradley's hand by making the story public first?" Marcus leaned forward. "You mean break the story this weekend? Before he can terminate anyone? The documentation is solid. The timeline is clear. And we have an inside source willing to go on record." Isabelle Monroe looked at Jessica. "Are you willing to do that?" "Really willing?" Jessica's hands shook slightly as she reached for her coffee. "If I do this, there's no going back. No family reconciliation, no corporate career, no safety net." "If you don't do this," Isabelle Monroe replied gently, "you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you had the power to stop something wrong and chose not to use it." Marcus was already making notes, his reporter's instincts engaged. "I can have the story ready by Sunday night, published online by Monday morning. By the time Bradley gets to his meeting, the narrative will already be public." Jessica closed her eyes, and when she opened them, Isabelle Monroe saw a different person, someone who had finally chosen principle over comfort. "Do it," Jessica said quietly. "Publish the story. I'll go on record." Isabelle Monroe felt a strange mixture of terror and relief. The point of no return was no longer ahead of them. It was now behind them, receding rapidly as they committed to a course of action that would reshape all their lives. The alliance was formed, fragile but determined, bound together by shared risk, and the hope that sometimes doing the right thing was worth the cost of doing it. The article went live at 6:47 a.m. on Monday morning, just as Isabelle Monroe was pouring her second cup of coffee. Her phone buzzed with Marcus's text. "It's done. Story is up. No going back now." The headline read, "Inside Stevens Industries: How Nepotism and Corporate Bullying Created a Toxic Workplace Culture." Below it, Jessica's professional headshot accompanied her byline as a contributing source, her credibility lending weight to every damning revelation. Isabelle Monroe had barely finished reading the article when her phone exploded with notifications. Missed calls from unknown numbers, text messages from colleagues, emails from reporters who'd somehow obtained her contact information. The story was spreading faster than she'd anticipated. At 7:15 a.m., Thomas Mitchell called. "Isabelle, what the hell is happening?" "My phone hasn't stopped ringing, and Bradley just sent an emergency meeting notice for 8 a.m. "Tom, I need you to know, whatever happens today, we tried to do the right thing." "We?" "Jesus, Isabelle, please tell me you weren't behind this article." She couldn't lie to him. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way." "But yes, we had to stop him before he destroyed more careers." The silence stretched long enough that Isabelle Monroe wondered if he'd hung up. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice a mixture of admiration and terror. "You realize he's going to come after you with everything he has now? He was already coming after me. At least this way, it's public." The emergency meeting was chaos barely contained by corporate politeness. Bradley sat at the head of the conference table, like a general whose battle plans had been leaked to the enemy. His usual composure had cracked, revealing the raw fury beneath his professional veneer. "I want to address the malicious and completely fabricated allegations that have been published about this department," he began, his voice tight with controlled rage. "These lies represent a coordinated attack on this company's reputation by disgruntled employees who lack the professionalism to address concerns through proper channels." Isabelle Monroe watched from across the table as Bradley's eyes found hers, then Jessica's, cataloging his enemies with predatory precision. Jessica sat rigid in her chair, her face pale but determined. "The individual who spoke to the press has violated confidentiality agreements and basic professional ethics," Bradley continued. "Legal action is being considered." But even as he spoke, Isabelle Monroe could see cracks in his armor. Sandra Torres from HR was taking detailed notes, her expression professionally neutral but alert. Several senior managers who'd been copied on the article were studying Bradley with new skepticism, seeing him through the lens of the documented evidence. The meeting ended without resolution, but the damage was done. By noon, the story had been picked up by 3 industry publications and shared across social media. The carefully constructed facade of Bradley's leadership was crumbling in real time. Isabelle Monroe's desk phone rang at 2:30 p.m. The caller ID showed the CEO's office. "Ms. Monroe, this is Margaret Stevens, CEO. I believe we need to talk." The storm had broken, and now they would all discover who would survive the aftermath and who would be swept away by the flood they'd unleashed. Margaret Stevens's office occupied the entire northeast corner of the 42nd floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the city that seemed to shrink everything below to insignificance. Isabelle Monroe had never been this high in the building before, had never imagined she'd find herself sitting across from the CEO whose family name graced the corporate letterhead. Margaret was younger than Isabelle Monroe had expected, perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of navigating corporate politics. She didn't look like someone who'd built her reputation on family connections. She looked like someone who'd earned her position through competence and steel. "Ms. Monroe," Margaret began, her voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. "I've read the article. I've also read the documentation that was provided to support it. Before we discuss next steps, I want to understand something. Why didn't you come to me directly?" The question wasn't accusatory, but it demanded honesty. Isabelle Monroe chose her words carefully. "Because I wasn't sure the message would reach you unchanged. Corporate hierarchies have ways of filtering information, especially when it reflects poorly on family members." Margaret's slight smile suggested she appreciated the directness. Bradley is my nephew, but he's also an employee. Family relationships don't supersede corporate governance, Ms. Monroe. They complicate it, certainly, but they don't override it. With respect, ma'am, that's not how it felt from where I was sitting. When someone has family connections and executive authority, speaking truth to power becomes significantly more dangerous. Which is why you chose to speak truth to the press instead. Isabelle Monroe met her gaze steadily. Yes, Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying her with the assessment of someone accustomed to reading people's motivations. The allegations in that article are serious. Systematic favoritism, manufactured performance issues, creating hostile work environments. If even half of it's true, it represents a fundamental failure of management. It's all true. Jessica Ashford provided documentation because she couldn't live with what she was seeing. She risked everything to do the right thing. Yes, Jessica. Margaret's expression softened slightly. I've known that girl since she was 12. Brilliant. Principled. Sometimes too honest for her own good. The fact that she was willing to go public tells me more about the severity of this situation than all the documentation combined. The intercom buzzed, and Margaret's assistant announced that Bradley Stevens was here for his scheduled meeting. Isabelle Monroe felt her stomach tighten, but Margaret simply nodded. Send him in? Ms. Monroe, I'd like you to stay, if you're comfortable with that. Bradley entered with his usual confidence, but Isabelle Monroe could see the cracks in his composure. His smile was too wide, his posture too rigid, like an actor who'd forgotten his lines but was determined to stay in character. Aunt Margaret, I'm glad you called this meeting. We need to discuss the malicious attack on our department and the legal options available to us. Sit down, Bradley. Margaret's tone carried an authority that Isabelle Monroe had never heard anyone use with him before. We need to discuss your management practices and the documented evidence of systemic workplace abuse. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic 42 floors below. Bradley's eyes flicked between his aunt and Isabelle Monroe, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something approaching panic. I don't understand. You can't seriously be giving credence to these fabricated accusations from a disgruntled employee who was already on a performance improvement plan. The performance improvement plan that you created as retaliation for her attempts to document your misconduct? Margaret's voice remained level, but steel had entered her tone. The PIP that was prepared before you even met with her, suggesting premeditation rather than legitimate performance concerns? Isabelle Monroe watched Bradley's carefully constructed reality crumble in real time. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely powerless, stripped of the corporate authority and family protection he'd wielded like weapons. Bradley, you're suspended pending a full internal investigation. Security will escort you out, and you're not to contact any current employees during this process. Your access to company systems has been revoked. You can't be serious. I've built this department, increased productivity by 30%. You've terrorized your staff and created a toxic environment that's now public knowledge. The board will be meeting this afternoon to discuss next steps, but your employment here is over. As security escorted Bradley out, Isabelle Monroe felt a complex mixture of vindication and exhaustion. The monster was slain, but the battlefield was littered with casualties, and she wasn't sure yet whether she was among the survivors or the wounded. Margaret turned back to her, and for the first time in months, Isabelle Monroe saw something she'd almost forgotten existed in corporate America: justice. 3 weeks later, Isabelle Monroe sat in the same conference room where Bradley had held his final emergency meeting, but the atmosphere had transformed completely. The new interim department head, Sarah Chen, had been brought in from the company's West Coast division. Someone with no connection to the previous toxic dynamics and a reputation for rebuilding damaged teams. I want to address the elephant in the room, Sarah said to the assembled staff. Everyone here has been through trauma. Some of you were targets, some were witnesses, and some were caught in impossible positions. We're not going to pretend it didn't happen, or that we can simply move forward without acknowledging what you've all endured. Isabelle Monroe glanced around the table, seeing faces that had been marked by months of stress beginning to show tentative signs of hope. Thomas Mitchell looked 10 years younger, the constant vigilance finally gone from his posture. Even some of Bradley's former allies seemed relieved to be free from the pressure of maintaining their precarious positions. Jessica sat across from her, having been offered a lateral transfer to another department, but choosing to stay and help rebuild what her uncle had damaged. The family fallout had been as brutal as she'd predicted. Bradley's termination had created a schism in the Stevens family that would likely take years to heal. But Jessica had found something valuable in the wreckage: her own integrity. The company has implemented new reporting structures, Sarah continued. Multiple channels for raising concerns, independent oversight of performance reviews, and mandatory training on workplace behavior for all management levels. We're also bringing in an external consultant to help us develop healthier team dynamics. After the meeting, Isabelle Monroe and Jessica found themselves alone in the break room, sharing coffee that actually tasted good for the first time in months. Any regrets? Isabelle Monroe asked. Jessica considered the question seriously. About exposing Uncle Bradley? No. About the family drama and the bridges I burned? Sometimes. But mostly I feel like I can look at myself in the mirror again. Marcus called yesterday, Isabelle Monroe said. The story won a regional journalism award. He wanted to thank us again. We changed things, Jessica said quietly. Not just here, but the article started conversations at other companies. I've gotten emails from people sharing their own stories, asking for advice about how to challenge toxic leadership. It was true. The ripple effects had extended far beyond Stevens Industries. Marcus's article had sparked a broader conversation about corporate accountability and workplace culture in their industry. 2 other companies had quietly removed problematic managers in the weeks following publication, and several professional organizations had announced new ethics initiatives. But the personal costs had been real. Bradley had attempted to file defamation lawsuits that were quickly dismissed once the evidence became public. He'd found employment with a smaller firm across the country, his reputation damaged, but not entirely destroyed. The Stevens family dynamics remained fractured, with some members supporting Margaret's decision while others blamed Jessica for the public embarrassment. Isabelle Monroe had received job offers from 3 competitors who valued her courage and integrity, but she'd chosen to stay. There was satisfaction in helping rebuild what had been broken, in proving that sometimes the system could work when good people refused to accept corruption. I've been thinking about something Margaret said, Isabelle Monroe told Jessica, about how speaking truth to power is always dangerous, but silence in the face of abuse is even more dangerous. She's right. We could have stayed quiet, kept our heads down, waited for someone else to act. But then we'd have been complicit in what happened to the next person, and the person after that. Thomas Mitchell appeared in the doorway, holding a coffee mug that read, World's Okayest Employee, a gift from his team that had become his favorite. Mind if I join you? He asked. I wanted to thank you both again. Not just for what you did, but for showing an old cynic that sometimes the good guys actually do win. They sat together in comfortable silence, 3 people who had discovered that integrity, while costly, was ultimately priceless. The afternoon sun streamed through the break room windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like possibilities. Small, delicate things that could either settle into stagnation or be lifted by the right kind of wind. Isabelle Monroe realized that she had learned something important about herself over these past months. When faced with the choice between safety and principles, she was someone who would choose principles. That knowledge felt like a foundation she could build the rest of her career on, regardless of what challenges lay ahead. The storm had passed, and in its wake, something stronger had grown. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.